The rich CEO mocked a single dad's scrap car, right until his homemade dream took the $5 million prize. The morning Giselle saw Wyatt's dirt yard, she just laughed. Not politely and not quietly. It was the arrogant laugh of a woman who had never tasted failure and was dead set she never would. People loved to judge mismatched tires and bare welds. They saw a greasy man under a junk frame, not a masterpiece. His 5-year-old girl stood nearby, squeezing a toy rabbit. Giselle controlled Vantech Motorsport. She built million-dollar racing machines and swept championships for 3 straight seasons. She bought the finest engineers on earth, completely blind to the fact that the rusty pile of junk sitting in that dirt yard was about to crush her elite machines across a $5 million finish line. Stick with me, because what Wyatt forged in that small yard took 3 tough years and 1 race to silence the world. Wyatt lived by a quiet, unbreakable daily routine. Every morning at 5:45, before his kid woke or the street made a peep, he crept downstairs in the pitch black and boiled water for 2 coffees. He kept this up since the very week Grace passed away, and he never could explain why he poured that second cup for 2 whole years after he lost her. He would pour the first steaming mug for himself, leave the second on the workbench right next to her picture, then just stand at the kitchen glass, staring at that hidden shape out in the dirt. That old tarp was completely sun-bleached. The worn bungee cords strapping it down were tearing at the metal hooks. But underneath that cheap plastic, the rusted car frame sat exactly where he left it, holding the slow progress he carved out the night before. This was the kind of gritty neighborhood Phoenix builds on its dusty outer edges. Sprawling lots and cheap low fences. Homes where folks bleed for a living and leave their garage doors up all weekend. Nobody really asked about the wild project in his yard. Isaac, who owned the auto shop nearby and carried 30 hard years of motor oil under his nails, watched that junk frame rise piece by piece over the months. He respected the dream, knowing exactly what it was without asking. Wyatt actually used to engineer cars for Vantech Motorsport, put in 4 grinding years before Cameron forced him out. That was the polite corporate version, the simple lie that fits nicely into 1 sentence. The real story involved a brilliant design document. Wyatt spent 11 agonizing months building a slick thermal system powered by natural heat flow instead of bulky forced pumps. Lighter, far simpler, and way more stable during extreme heat runs than any garbage Vantech had on their drawing boards. He submitted it through their strict channels, just receiving a blank corporate nod back. They brushed him off, claiming it would be reviewed next development cycle. 6 weeks pass and Cameron pitches that exact homemade genius to the elite board as his own. Just 8 weeks after that betrayal, Wyatt was dragged into an office and coldly told his contract was dead due to fake performance issues. Their proof was incredibly thin and vague. Just the usual corporate trash used to justify stealing his work. Wyatt cleared his desk, then drove home, and sat numb in his driveway for a very long time before walking through that door. Grace was still alive back then. She met him at the front door, just holding him in total silence. She understood the cruel world, knowing that some crushing defeats. You and I know they don't need explaining before you mourn them. He didn't steal a single Vantech blueprint when he walked away. He didn't need to. Every exact inch of that homemade build already lived right inside his head. It happens when you let a dream settle deep inside your bones. When you obsess over a scrap car long enough, those thoughts turn into pure understanding. In the 2 years since Grace passed away, that backyard project became his therapy, shaping grief into steel wire and reclaimed scrapyard parts. Little Arya grew up watching it all unfold. She was just 5 now, old enough to judge which rusty tools made the coolest noises and which pieces of that junk car frame actually belonged together. She even named her stuffed toy rabbit Gravel. When Wyatt asked her why, she thought about it with that intense seriousness only little kids have, then declared that gravel always gets stuck under the wheels. People ignore the dirt, but once those tires roll over it, it flies fast and far. Wyatt just stared at his kid for a second, much longer than he meant to, before diving right back into his mechanical grind. The Phoenix Desert Classic registration email finally hit his inbox on Thursday. Picture this brutal endurance event. 200 kilometers of rugged, mixed terrain just outside the city. No commercial division rules at all. $5 million in cold cash handed to the first racing machine crossing that finish line. Wyatt scanned the rules 3 times. He dialed Isaac, then kept his mouth completely shut. That flashy automotive exhibition hit the downtown convention center every single spring. and Isaac convinced Wyatt to haul his bare scrap frame there, completely unfinished. He still faced months of brutal work, but the bones were solid enough to show real engineering, hoping someone might sponsor a few car parts for a spot on the entry form. During registration, Wyatt booked the absolute cheapest, smallest square footage tucked in the back. He backed his rusty trailer in. He tossed up a basic cardboard sign listing the homemade car's specs on one printed page. No flashy corporate banners, no pit crew wearing crisp, matching million-dollar team shirts either. What he had was pure grit and the patience to explain his underdog build to anyone willing to stop and truly listen. A few actually did. A retired fabrication engineer killed 40 minutes grilling him on the technical magic behind those clever convection channels. And right before he walked away, he promised to donate 2 spare pieces of aluminum tubing just collecting dust in his garage. An off-road vehicle parts supplier even snapped a quick photo of his genius suspension geometry. But let me tell you, that wasn't the highlight. What made history that morning was Giselle. She swaggered in with 5 lackeys, camera hovering right there at her polished shoulder, strutting through that exhibition floor exactly like elite billionaires who expect the world to part for them. The massive Vantech Motorsports booth completely dominated one giant corner, flaunting their brand-new competition machine, propped up on a carbon fiber stage glowing with the kind of smug polish that takes a solid day to shine and costs more than Wyatt's entire life savings to maintain. Giselle wore a sharp dark jacket, walking with the totally arrogant, practiced efficiency of a CEO who does this constantly, completely bored and unimpressed by everyday garage mechanics. She just scanned the floor, never lingering. Exactly how the rich skim a room, hunting for anything worth a second of their time. Cameron leaned in, whispering right by her ear, and nodded toward the far wall. She followed his mocking line of sight. What she saw was Wyatt's race car on a trailer, bare frame, rough weld lines, and 4 mismatched wheels. You and I know a true underdog build. She also spotted Arya sitting on a nearby folding chair, holding her pet rabbit, watching the elite crowd with wide, patient eyes. The CEO turned back toward the display, saying nothing initially. Then her voice cut through the room, loudly wondering who had allowed this homemade scrap to be here. People nearby caught that. A few turned. The quiet mechanic stood up from the engine part he was adjusting, his face completely blank. He spoke up in his usual steady, completely unhurried, measured way, explaining the frame used asymmetric thermal diffusion right inside the custom engine housing, and how natural convection cooling completely stripped away the need for any forced pump, and that the projected, sustained friction drop over a high heat run beat those million-dollar machines by 17%. Giselle let him finish speaking. Then she smirked that his homemade dream looked like scrap from a salvage yard. She pivoted and marched right back to the Vantech display, her corporate entourage moving alongside. Cameron stayed behind for a split second at the edge of the crowd. He stared at the scrap car with a look that wasn't exactly mockery. It was tighter, more like nervous insecurity before he turned and hurried away. The surrounding crowd quickly drifted back to whatever they were doing. A couple of them chuckled quietly. Not malicious, just that awkward sound people make when tension finally breaks. Little Arya had heard every single word. She looked up at her dad in silence, carefully watching his face to see how he would react. Wyatt squatted down, meeting her right at eye level, and asked if gravel felt too small. She shook her head. He said that was good. Isaac stood at the very back of the room gripping his phone, and he didn't put that device away for a really long time. Later that night, inside his quiet garage, Wyatt opened his design binder straight to the pressure valve schematic. He circled a bold modification he'd been weighing for 3 weeks. He jotted down a number in the margin, extra hours needed, and a date. He didn't dwell on the insults thrown around that morning at the racing exhibition, or if it crossed his mind. You and I know how he handled obstacles. He figured out exactly where it crossed paths with his current task, grabbed whatever detail was useful, and totally ignored the rest. The rest, in this case, meant absolutely nothing. He simply added 15 hours to his build schedule and kept grinding. The real hurdle to finishing this car was money, and Wyatt tackled that the exact same way he handled any problem, by calculating just how huge it was, and then figuring out, step by step, how to crush it. The missing cash was about $8,000, needed for cooling shrouds and aerodynamic bodywork, so he grabbed extra shifts at the local garage. He squeezed in weekend consulting for an amateur racing crew struggling to diagnose a stubborn engine misfire. and he slashed his own living expenses with brutal precision, leaving absolutely 0 pennies unaccounted for. Isaac chipped in spare materials from his own shop, never cash. Let's be real, Wyatt would have refused money but accepted parts hoarded for decades. You and I know why a real mechanic keeps old parts, because useful scrap always finds a way to become useful again. His daughter Arya once asked if they were poor. Wyatt simply said they were careful. To a kid, that seemed like a perfectly reasonable answer. The whole homemade race car relied on 2 simple rules. Rules Wyatt built over years in the dirt, failing, fixing, and refining his backyard build until it was perfect. First rule: when you are running a brutal desert endurance race, the machine that survives the finish line always beats the shiny exotic car leading the early miles. Overheating always killed off the rich guys first at the famous Phoenix Classic. That brutal mix of flat-out, sustained high-speed output and baking heat pushing past 40 degrees Celsius on the track. Surface-roasted standard forced cooling setups, brutally punishing any tiny flaw in those million-dollar corporate machines. But Wyatt's clever natural convection setup didn't need a water pump. No fragile computers, and no backup fail-safes, because the guy designed it with 0 single points of failure. Engine heat just flowed passively through custom channels carved right into the block's outer walls. It pulled heat away from the core, bleeding it right out through the race car's actual physical frame. Lighter, simpler, and out in the desert, the Phoenix Classic proved this homemade rig was bulletproof. His second secret weapon was a passive wind deflector slapped across the old car's roofline. Purely mechanical, not a single electronic sensor in sight, driven completely by shifts in air pressure. It adjusted on its own, cutting crosswind drag far better than the rigid wings those rich racing teams used. Wyatt picked up this core setup from a guy who spent 40 years building dirt track cars in the old days before computers made true mechanical genius seem worthless. The design wasn't flashy or complex, it was just right. Meanwhile, let's watch Cameron build at Vantech. They just unlocked a massive budget for the Phoenix Classic, pushing their high-tech development cycle into absolute overdrive. The expensive beast they were building, known as the Vone. With Cameron as lead driver, the rich team ran dual electric cooling pumps, a screaming engine perfectly tuned to dump maximum power in the first 100 kilometers, and a sleek body kit designed in a multi-million-dollar wind tunnel. They were laughing. Cameron checked the entry list. He spotted the Underdog's name. The CEO scoured the public records for the homemade car's specs, registered as G00, finding absolutely nothing. But that silence terrified him. Cameron knew enough about engineering to realize that hiding the public specs on a scrap build wasn't proof that the Underdog's design was just a joke to ignore. He learned that hard lesson years ago, by spotting the genius in someone else's work before that Underdog had the money or power to protect it. 3 short weeks before the final deadline, Wyatt and Isaac towed the Underdog car out to an empty city highway at 2 in the morning. No press, 0 rich sponsors, and absolutely no paper trail. The homemade dream fired up, not perfect. The wheels shook at top speed, a tiny tie rod flaw Wyatt calmly noted down to fix before race week in the desert. But trust me, that engine screamed for 40 minutes of. It ran hard with 0 overheating warnings flashing. When they finally pulled over and let the scrap car idle, Isaac circled the build slowly with his flashlight. Then he stepped back and tapped the warm hood twice with his knuckles. You and I know exactly what that meant. The homemade car was real. Then came a quiet evening 2 weeks later. Arya's fever spiked hard that night. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He just dragged his sleeping bag right onto her bedroom floor and stayed planted there until the fever finally broke. The mechanic completely ignored his workshop for 2 straight days. He didn't care if the racing schedule slipped. Family always came first. On the 3rd morning, she woke up clear-headed, asking for orange juice. But the very next thing out of her mouth, she wanted to know if the race car was still outside. Wyatt promised her the car was still there, and so was he. She seemed pretty satisfied with both of those answers. That Tuesday afternoon, Giselle brought her own expensive ride into his repair shop for a basic oil change, brake check, and a tire rotation. Her assistant booked it. She hadn't even looked at the auto shop's name. But she definitely noticed Wyatt walking out to grab her keys, standing quietly in the harsh, bright light of the service bay. She stayed put. Nobody mentioned the upcoming racing exhibition. They just kept quiet. Wyatt worked fast, handing her keys back in under a single hour. But as she stepped up to the front desk to pay, she glanced over at his workbench. A photo was pinned by the monitor. a dark-haired woman in her 30s, captured mid-law with a truly genuine smile. Giselle bluntly asked if it was his wife. Wyatt quietly said she had passed. A heavy silence fell over the shop right then. Giselle walked out without another single word. She dropped a tip doubling the total bill and left absolutely zero explanation behind. Wyatt stared at that massive tip on the receipt for a long moment after she finally drove away. Then the CEO Cameron showed up, no phone call ahead whatsoever. He drove his own car and parked. He strolled in with that smug, wealthy confidence, fully convinced in advance that this little meeting would go exactly the way he planned. He looked Wyatt in the eye, offering $25,000. Just to buy his cooling system plans and force his withdrawal from the Phoenix Classic. He pitched it like a perfectly logical, totally reasonable business deal. It's the kind of dirty buyout we see when rich guys get scared. Wyatt just stared at him for a long moment. Stared so long that Cameron nearly panicked and filled the dead silence. Then Wyatt calmly noted that a millionaire was offering $25,000 just to say this scrap car couldn't win. He added that one of them was dead wrong, and Cameron should really think about who. Cameron stormed out empty-handed, no blueprints, no formal race withdrawal. The rich guy just sat fuming in his luxury car before finally driving away. Hannah had reported on the Phoenix Classic for 3 years. She had a real knack for sniffing out those hidden underdog stories the mainstream racing world completely ignored. The official media always focused entirely on the well-funded teams, the massive corporate sponsorships and familiar names. But let's be honest, the real magic always hides at the bottom of the list, down where broke mechanics with huge homemade dreams were quietly getting ready to fight. That's where she spotted Wyatt. No sponsors, zero public profile. Just a handwritten car name scribbled on an official racing sheet. And she tracked down his garage. She introduced herself straight up, explaining her Underdog racing story. Her questions cut way deeper than the usual Motorsport reporter fluff, meaning she cared about his garage engineering goals, not just digging for cheap emotional sound bites about the upcoming race. Still, the quiet mechanic guarded his words. No mention of Vantech's millions, no mention of the thief Cameron. When she asked why he walked away from that fancy engineering job, he simply replied that he never actually left. She jotted it down without pushing, earning a little trust from the scrappy builder. Isaac had been quietly compiling a file for 2 years, just a practical guy bracing for the long game. Because guys who see enough corporate bullying learn to keep receipts without anyone ever telling them to. Like a seasoned builder measuring twice before making the final cut. It is just how you survive out here. Inside were photos of his original garage blueprints, snapped on a kitchen table weeks before the corporate suits ever saw them. Hard proof stamped right in the metadata. He also included a printed side-by-side comparison he built himself. Detailed notes breaking down the blueprints. Against the shiny patent Cameron filed for Vantech 6 months after kicking the real creator out. Isaac handed this bombshell over completely behind the mechanic's back, slipping it to her one Saturday, while Wyatt was completely distracted at his daughter's school event. Hannah read the whole thing but held her fire. She kept the bombshell locked down. You and I know timing is everything. The hard facts were finally there, but the right moment to strike just had not arrived yet. Fast forward to the big race week. Up in her luxury suite, Giselle skimmed the entry list, her usual corporate pre-race ritual, just like she did before every single Phoenix Classic since buying out the big team. Her assistant handed over the standard neat printouts. She breezed right through the million-dollar teams until she hit the absolute bottom of the barrel. No giant sponsors, no deep pockets, just a scrap build named Gravel. She froze dead. That name sparked something. The little kid with the toy rabbit, the grease-stained binder on a messy garage workbench. She dragged Cameron right in and demanded to know who this mechanic really was. The golden boy hesitated just a fraction too long. Normally, a delay like that means absolutely nothing at all. But when the boss asks about a nobody threatening their millions, it screams absolute screaming guilt. Giselle caught the slip but kept her mouth totally shut that entire night. Once he walked out, she cracked open her laptop, burning the midnight oil on files that had absolutely zero to do with track day strategy. Meanwhile, the single dad was running his final driveway inspection by the beam of a flashlight, checking the cheap oil, tire pressure, tightening up every old suspension bolt, slowly circling the welded scrap metal, making sure nothing rattled loose on the bumpy trailer ride. His little girl sat on the porch in pajamas, hugging her rabbit, watching her hero work. She asked if he was terrified. He nodded, so she asked why he was racing anyway. He smiled and told her what her mom always believed. The only thing worse than losing to million-dollar machines is never firing up the engine at all. And honestly, you and I know that little kid absorbed that truth with the quiet seriousness it deserved. She promised to hold that stuffed rabbit gravel extra tight once the race started. He told her that would definitely help. Race day hit 41 degrees before 9 o'clock in the morning. The Phoenix Desert Classic grid held 27 cars in 5 rows. And the contrast there? It told you everything about money versus sheer human grit. Something no glossy racing program could ever communicate. The Vantech's car sat on pole position, gleaming and professionally branded, swarmed by a pit crew of 7 in matching high-tech gear. Meanwhile, Isaac had driven the trailer hauling Wyatt's scrap build out at 5 a.m. They quietly parked in the far outside lane, ignored by everyone. That homemade machine had 0 sponsors. No flashy decals, just a handwritten race number on a simple whiteboard, zip-tied straight to the door. The number read G00. Up in the VIP section, Giselle stood high above the dirt, getting a perfect view of the starting grid. Her eyes locked right onto Wyatt's little Underdog car in the far lane. She stood there, staring at the scrap build in total silence, ignoring the rich executives around her. Down in the cheap seats, Isaac walked with little Arya. They grabbed seats right on the inside rail, getting a perfect view of the start and finish. He settled in with his coffee, projecting that quiet competence that had anchored Wyatt's racing life for the better part of 3 long years. Arya propped her stuffed rabbit on the armrest, turning it so the toy could watch her dad race. The green flag dropped clean. Vaughn surged off the grid with pure corporate authority, his machine built just to dominate those first 40 kilometers. A massive engine tuned for straightaway speed, sleek aerodynamics perfected for flat, open desert dirt, $200,000 of engineering aimed dead ahead. Cameron pushed his rig the exact way he always did early on. Total, arrogant commitment. The absolute confidence of a wealthy man who never once had a reason to doubt the million-dollar machine underneath him. As for Wyatt, he sat in 9th after Sector 1, but he fully expected to trail behind on that wide-open stretch. His homemade cooling system offered 0 advantage on a cool, flat surface moving at top speed. It was never meant to. The true genius of his scrap build demanded conditions we hadn't seen yet. Brutal, sustained heat. The savage punishment 200 kilometers of raw desert inflicts on a fancy car that was never built to take a real beating. He stayed in 9th, calmly watching the temperature gauge on his handmade dash cluster. And that number sat exactly where his garage math said it would. By the 40th kilometer, 3 rich teams had already quit. 2 blown cooling systems, plus a snapped suspension on the rocky stretch opening stage 2. The outside air had reached 43 degrees. The desert floor was baking, blasting vicious heat right back up into the bellies of those fragile supercars. Cameron's shiny computer flashed a thermal warning at kilometer 47. Not a critical alarm yet, just an early alert. The kind meant to give a driver plenty of time to cool down before absolute disaster struck. He backed off by roughly 15% and safely held the lead. Stick with me here. Wyatt quietly passed 2 broken-down supercars, sliding into 7th place. Hannah waited at the kilometer 60 checkpoint, holding a massive camera lens and a notepad. She snapped photos of Wyatt's homemade rig roaring through. She'd later write that his exhaust temperature looked impossible for a car holding that far up the pack, meaning that junker ran too cool. We thought his scrap engine would cook, but it ran at a thermal load no race car had any right surviving. Halfway through the 50-kilometer stage, the ground turned into brutal, jagged, broken rock. Tight squeezes and off-camber drops. You and I know this dirt levels everything. It strips away expensive speed and forces drivers to rely on raw precision. Wyatt knew this track perfectly. He memorized satellite maps and drove the route himself in his beat-up truck 3 months prior, stopping his truck to walk those brutal sections on his own 2 feet. He knew exactly where things squeezed tight. He memorized the fake fast lines and spotted tricky, slow-looking curves he could take flat out without touching his brakes once. His homemade build climbed from 7th to 5th here without one direct pass. 2 expensive rigs suffered catastrophic failures, and Wyatt just cruised right past the spots where those million-dollar machines had died. His junk car's temperature gauge stayed frozen. Meanwhile, at kilometer 90, the CEO was desperately managing his supercar's overheating issues over radio with his tech crew. forcing himself to slow down, fighting to survive thermal limits that shrank with every mile. The CEO still held first place, but that arrogant, untouchable freedom was completely gone now. Up top, Giselle ditched the VIP suite and marched down to the ground-level timing monitors when that 90-kilometer update hit. She didn't utter a single word to the smug corporate crew she had been standing with. She just stared at the big board, watching the impossible race updates cycle through. The homemade junker hit fourth place at kilometer 90, third by kilometer 103, right after another rich guy's rig lost fuel pressure and choked on the dirt track. He snatched second at kilometer 120 when the next biggest corporate beast shredded a tire on jagged rock. A rocky crossing the single dad cleared at full throttle, trusting the perfect line he had found while walking that exact stretch 3 months prior. The timing monitor flashed again. Giselle stood completely frozen before it, arms pinned straight down, not saying a single word to anyone around her. Then the CEO heard the radio. His crew warned him the scrap car held second at kilometer 122, gaining ground so incredibly fast their computers were throwing red flags. He demanded the gap, 4 seconds. He was entirely too stunned to ask anything else. Think about it. He finally realized what it meant for a garage build to catch him. A scrap car he had actively tried to suppress was now hovering just 4 seconds back, deep inside a 200-kilometer race. Panicking, he pushed harder, and his supercar's heat alarms instantly flared up. The fancy cooling pump screamed at maximum. The margin froze, then shrank down to 3 seconds, then 2.5. Then the desert walls closed in as the track hit its tightest, narrowest choke point. The official maps warned this was a brutal one-car corridor cutting through 200 meters of jagged stone, barely 10 feet wide at the worst possible pinch. His massive $1 million machine was simply too wide for the fast racing line. The CEO could clear it, but only at a literal crawl, a painful time penalty he arrogantly accepted in his expensive master race plan. But he never planned for the mechanic. That little homemade scrap build was 11 inches slimmer and 4 inches shorter, and it was welded together by a single dad who walked that exact canyon at 9 a.m. on a quiet February morning, gripping a cheap tape measure. We watched Wyatt blast out of that impossible squeeze at blinding speed, ripping onto the dirt 20 meters ahead of the stunned CEO. The high-dollar machine had to brake hard on the entry. Inside Cameron's pristine cockpit, the radio channel went dead for several long seconds. His engineer finally called his name. Cameron didn't say a single word. Picture this with me. The final 30 kilometers run slightly downhill right toward the city skyline. The terrain opens from jagged rock to packed gravel, leading to a 2-lane hardtop section for the final 8 kilometers, feeding right into the finish circuit. Our garage-built hero hit that open section sitting on a 3-second lead. Cameron closed that gap on the hardtop. Vaughn had more brutal raw speed on flat ground, and its cooling system had fully recovered after the rocky section. 4 kilometers left, and the corporate star was 1 second behind. At the second-to-last turn, Cameron made a ruthless move, using the road's entire width to shove Wyatt toward the outer edge. It wasn't technically against the rulebook, but everyone knew it was a dirty, deliberate tactic, the kind of desperation you see when a driver runs out of clean tricks, options, and has simply decided that playing dirty is totally acceptable. Over at the spectator rail, Isaac just raised his phone and filmed in total silence. Arya asked what was going on. Isaac told her to just keep watching. Wyatt felt that heavy pressure, but he refused to fight it directly. He actually let Cameron take the inside line, eating the sudden loss of momentum. Then he swept through the final corner on the outside, a wider arc costing him a tiny fraction of a second, but saving the mechanics of a scrap build that had been redlining for over 170 kilometers. He rocketed out of that final corner sitting ahead by 0.6 of a second. He crossed that finish line 17 seconds ahead of Cameron. Look closely. The margin was clean, undeniable, and locked in by 4 independent timing systems. Wyatt brought his garage-built machine to a dead stop in the designated finishing zone. He just sat there in the driver's seat for a long moment, totally frozen. He pulled off his helmet, gripping it with both tired hands right against the steering wheel. He didn't look at a single person. He stared up through the dusty windshield at the sky, that flat white-blue glare of a late spring Phoenix afternoon. Finally, he popped the metal door open and climbed out. A race official finally let Arya through the gate. Isaac had stalled the guy just long enough so her dad could cross that finish line. She sprinted across the dirt staging area, hugging gravel tightly under one arm, and crashed right into Wyatt. He caught his daughter, lifting her high and holding her tight against his dusty racing suit. She cheered that he won. He smiled, saying gravel was the real winner. She pulled back, looked at the battered car, then at him, weighing this very seriously. Then she decided that both things could absolutely be true at once. The winner's ceremony was quick and efficient, exactly the way dirt race ceremonies go when the organizing crew has run the exact same event for 11 straight years. Wyatt accepted the Underdog's trophy and the prize check before a small crowd of lingering racing fans. He gave short, highly technical answers to the announcer's questions about his scrap build, making sure to thank Isaac by name. He never said a word about Vantech. He completely ignored Cameron. He left out the exhibition hall and never mentioned the woman who had laughed. Over in the press area, Hannah quietly watched the trophy ceremony. She had already filed her daily race report. After the ceremony wrapped, she opened a second document, the one asking a question you and I have wondered for weeks. What was the true origin of that engineering design? She published the exposé right through her own media outlet. Isaac's hard evidence was attached as a digital appendix. She didn't actually point any fingers in the text of the article. She just laid out two documents, their dates, and their identical blueprints. Then she posed one simple question in the final paragraph, asking if the Phoenix Classic champion had actually raced using his own original designs. Like any sharp reporter, she left the final verdict up to the readers. Cameron crossed the finish line second, 16 brutal seconds behind Wyatt's homemade machine. He bolted straight to the corporate VIP tent, completely ignoring the racing press. But Giselle wasn't waiting inside that VIP tent. She stood out by the dusty staging lanes when Cameron finally pulled in. She let his expensive pit crew scatter before she said a single word. Their chat was private, 0 cameras rolling. Once it ended, Cameron jumped into his streetcar, left the track, and vanished. Giselle marched through the pits toward Wyatt. He was standing by his winning scrap build while Isaac supervised loading it onto the rusty trailer. She walked over without her usual pack of corporate suits. No fancy assistant. No hype man to introduce her or set the corporate tone for the conversation. Wyatt watched her approach and held his ground. She stayed quiet at first. She stared at his scrap build, taking in the hand-painted numbers on the door. She studied the cheap greenhouse paint rolled straight over bare metal. Finally, she locked eyes with the quiet mechanic who just shocked everyone. She swore she hadn't known about the stolen patent filing until 2 nights ago. Wyatt studied the CEO's face for a long second, then plainly said he believed her. She explained Cameron had worked for her massive tech firm for 6 years, and she blindly trusted his engineering reports without digging deeper. Let me tell you, she owned it. She admitted failing to verify his work, calling it her own massive oversight, offering 0 lame excuses. She stopped right there. She didn't brush it off as some corporate mix-up, a simple paperwork glitch, or just 2 guys having slightly different engineering ideas. Wyatt nodded. He already knew. Cameron acted totally alone, and her admitting that actually meant something to him. But he also made it crystal clear that apologies didn't fix what was stolen, or the long years spent building a winning race car out of pure scrap, just to prove his stolen engine designs actually worked. Giselle took the hit silently. She gave one slow nod and didn't try to fill the awkward silence. For the first time in 3 long years, someone tied to that massive theft stood in front of this underdog without a hidden agenda, without pitching a counter-argument, without twisting the hard facts to make him settle for anything less than the truth. He definitely didn't forgive her. But he didn't blame the CEO for the crime Cameron committed completely alone either. He just judged her with the same harsh precision he used to build engines and decided she was actually telling the cold truth. Isaac popped around the rusty trailer, took one look at them, and quietly went back to tying down the winning race car. Isaac was never a very subtle guy in normal life, but he knew exactly when to back off and give his buddy some space. The winner's check was totally real, sitting right at $5 million. You and I might have fainted, but Wyatt didn't spend the night staring at it or feel dizzy over his sudden rags-to-riches payday. He dialed the lawyer, who handled the original lease for his quiet little repair shop, and set up a meeting. He phoned the school, locking in Arya's enrollment for the upcoming year. That very evening, he sat with Isaac at the kitchen table. They ran through the prize money math, barely speaking a word outside of hard numbers. After Isaac headed out, the quiet mechanic just stood there, staring at the kitchen counter. Finally, He took a drive to the late-night ice cream stand. He and his daughter sat on the hood of his beat-up truck, quietly eating their ice cream together in the warm evening air. Little Arya had gravel in her lap. She was rambling on, wondering if wild rabbits would actually enjoy eating ice cream cones. Wyatt listened closely, adding a few thoughts to a debate they never really settled. Picture this. 3 weeks after shocking the racing world, his shop looked exactly the same. Every wrench sat in its usual spot. The board above the desk still held those same messy abbreviations Isaac taught him way back during his very first year. Grace's photo remained resting right on the workbench, just next to the computer. And the scrap car itself, good old gravel. The rusty green Underdog that somehow crossed the finish line first at the Phoenix Desert Classic. It just sat out in the yard, totally uncovered, resting in the open air right there in the exact dirt patch where he first built it. He really had no reason to hide it anymore. He never even bothered replacing the cheap bungee cords after the last rusty hook finally snapped. For weeks, he kept thinking about how to spend his slice of that massive prize money. One thought always beat the rest. A community workshop, not some million-dollar corporate racing operation. Not a slick engineering brand with a rigid growth plan, just a simple, honest place. A garage where folks with raw technical ideas but zero cash could come borrow good tools, heavy equipment, and the support of other underdogs working hard to build something real. He had not made announcements or filed any official paperwork. He just thought it over, which for a guy like Wyatt practically meant the decision was final. Stick with me here. Giselle arrived Wednesday, driving herself this time. She brought one envelope, dropping it on his messy workbench near the photo, skipping the usual corporate small talk. She called it a formal offer to jointly develop his scrappy team's thermal management technology. Not a buyout, not some cheap licensing deal. A true shared ownership setup with both their names and simple terms drafted in plain English by an outside lawyer completely disconnected from Vantech. She told the mechanic he didn't have to answer today. Wyatt stared back, not that fast, judging look of a guy sizing up a business deal, but the deeper, quieter gaze of a man truly measuring someone's character, ignoring all the smug things she'd said before. The CEO took the stare, holding her posture and expression perfectly still, and he realized, studying her in that raw garage light, that she was actually a person he could stand in front of and look straight in the eye. He simply offered her some coffee. She glanced at the 2 mugs sitting on his bench. Just like every single morning, one sat by the dirty monitor, and the other rested quietly beside the photograph. She stared at those homemade mugs a split second longer than she really needed to. And when she finally looked up, you and I could see her expression shift in a tiny, undeniable way. You see, this had nothing to do with business. She simply said, yes. Arya emerged from the back of the garage, where she had been quietly organizing socket wrenches by size. The kid always did that when grown-ups talked. She just wanted to stay close without getting in the way. She came out clutching gravel, sizing up Giselle with that blunt, unfiltered judgment that 5-year-olds hand out to absolutely everyone, and asked if she was the rich woman who laughed at her dad's homemade car. The quiet mechanic started to speak, but Giselle raised a hand. The humbled CEO crouched down to the kid's eye level and softly admitted, yes, that was her, and she was deeply sorry. Arya weighed that apology carefully, processing the confession the way a smart kid handles big moments. Then she held the toy out to Giselle, announcing that her rabbit was named Gravel, named after her dad's Underdog car because Gravel was tiny, ignored by everyone, but still flew incredibly far. The humbled executive took the little rabbit in both hands, inspecting it. Then she looked right at Arya, telling her that it was an absolutely brilliant name, and whoever came up with it had to be a genuine genius. Arya proudly stated she thought of it herself. Giselle smiled, saying she figured as much. Wyatt walked over to his worn side counter, pouring coffee from the pot he had brewed 20 minutes ago. Warm afternoon light spilled through the high, dusty window at the back of the Underdog's garage, and stretched across the concrete floor in a wide, sweeping angle. He heard Giselle ask Arya a real follow-up question about her gravel theory. Not some fake corporate small talk, and definitely not a question meant to brush her off, but a sincere question that dug into exactly what the kid said, asking for the deeper story. He heard his daughter answer with that heavy, serious authority she always saved for things she had pondered over for a very long time. The quiet mechanic didn't even turn around to watch them. He just stood by the coffee pot, soaking in the moment. Then he placed one cup in its usual spot by the racing photograph, carrying the second cup straight over to the greasy workbench where Giselle sat, and he gently placed it down right in front of her. Then he sat down on the shop stool across from the CEO. They sat in complete silence for a second, the kind of quiet people share when that massive wall of arrogant noise between them has finally, through sheer effort, a little time, and some brutal honesty, been completely cleared away and